and I'm really looking forward. Oh, thanks, Nate. Got it. So I'm looking forward to tonight, especially. We're going to start off with a talk by Ken Fang on the role and the importance, and some tips on the TPP. Then Rupa Ramamurthy is going to talk about project management in general and specific project management tools that can come into play. And we're going to finish off with Riley Gardner, who is an executive at Global Data, a business intelligence database that the interns have access to this summer to facilitate, to help on the creation of the TPPs from sort of the marketing, commercialization, business side. But before I introduce Ken, I'm just going to hand it over to Jenny Jancy of the Catalyst program that just has a quick word about well, go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, sure. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully you can see those. I just wanted to bring up a opportunity that's really complementary to what we offer in our Catalyst program year. And it could be really helpful for our awardee project teams to go through this process. And it's a National Science Foundation Innovation Course, or I-Corps. And it is a course that is offered once a month. It is basically 8 days. It's a Monday, Wednesday, Monday, and for a few hours. And you really get exposed to the lean startup methodology, kind of figure out who your customer segments are, what your value propositions is, and really try to define this product market fit a little bit better. It's again, great entrepreneurs, instructors that it's run out of, you can see here, UC Berkeley, but it's a whole Bay Area. It's in conjunction with UCSF, Berkeley, Stanford, Davis. And then if you go through this course and found it worthwhile, you have a potential to actually even go to National I-Corps program, which is a 7-week, more intensive, a lot more, talking to a lot more people, a lot more customers, but it comes with a $50,000 grant. Anyway, the reason why I bring this up, we're going to talk a little bit more about this kind of methodology next workshop, but I wanted to bring this up because the application is coming up on July 29th for the next cohort, and this cohort in August could be a really great time to go through the I-Corps program. So you can apply and learn more at bayicorps.com. And also, we'll send these out, but Dave is the program manager, program director of this over at Berkeley, and he is absolutely great and always willing to talk to you about if you have more questions. So.
Hey, you know what, Jenny, thank you very much for that. And real quick, one more thing before I introduce Ken. Stephanie Maris, please very, very quickly mention your upcoming entrepreneurship course.
Hey, thanks, Charles. Hi, everyone. I run a global online course for life science healthcare entrepreneurship. And we have people all over the United States and in Europe and in Asia taking this class. It's 10 weeks, 2 hours a week, and optional small groups. Runs through everything that you need to know to start a startup in life sciences and healthcare, and it's using Silicon Valley guest lecturers. So if you have any interest, my name is on the screen. You can send me a direct email. Actually, I'll put it into, oh, thank you, Nate. Nate has put the link in. So glad to tell you more about it and not to take up too much time here. Thank you, Charles.
Sure enough. Hey, thank you very much, Stephanie. Hey, so it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Fang. Ken went to Penn both as an undergraduate and then as a medical student, where he has his MD from, and then he did his residency, his residency and fellowship at UCSF, and then stayed at UCSF for 20 some years as a professor. Went into the private sector and has had his career had a really strong focus in diagnostics, medical diagnostics, but it's much broader now in terms of his areas of interest and expertise. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Fang who's going to talk to us tonight about the TPP. It's, well, let's just see what Ken has to say. So thanks a lot, Ken.
Great. Thanks, Charles, for the introduction. And just to have people a little bit more depth of my background. At UC, I was in the Department of Medicine. I'm a pulmonologist by training. My clinical work was done in ICU and lung fibrosis and general pulmonary. My lab focused on proteomics and basically tissue remodeling, cell signaling. And as Charles mentioned, since I left to go into biotech, I've been primarily doing biomarker-related translational medicine projects, really sort of bridging the gap between basic science and clinical applications. And so, with that, a lot of the work that I've done is really going to be sort of the focus of this particular discussion today. And in the past, we've done it in person, also a little bit online. It's been really helpful to really make this a discussion. Obviously, we're not in a lecture hall. So I would encourage you, and maybe Charles, you and Nate can sort of help, let me know when there's questions. And what I'll do is I'll try to remember to take questions after each, slide or every couple of slides, because it really would be helpful, I think, for you all to ask me questions along the way, because I think there's a lot of concepts being discussed here that each slide could take multiple hours. I think the idea is to sort of cover a broad range of aspects of what a target profile is and what it can do. And my communication with Charles, the other thing he asked me to focus on today was to not discuss just the importance and what it is, but also how to do it. And I think that's particularly time I'm actually working with the company right now. We spent the last couple of months basically doing this exact same thing and whittling down a variety of concepts, trying to sort of prioritize and figure out exactly what the company should do. And I would say that of all and I'm currently working as a consultant, and of all the things that I've done the last couple of years as consulting, this is the number one thing in terms of corporate strategy, is trying to figure out how to prioritize a company's efforts. And Charles, just remind me, what's our general time frame for the discussion?
I'd keep it keep it less than a half hour.
Okay, great.
Wait, one quick thing, because I see that people have joined since Nate mentioned this. If you have a question, type it in the chat, because Nate ProRock here is going to be monitoring that. And take it away, Ken. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
and Ken, could you put it in presentation mode?
Yeah, I can. I was helping look at the slide. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So again, please stop me with questions, and I'll try to go through. There's only about a dozen or so slides, so I'd like to focus on your questions. So these templates, which you should have paper copies of, these were put together by some of my colleagues, a number of years ago in the Catalyst program. And they did a fantastic job of listing sort of the categories of the ideas of, how you can sort of begin to outline, your target product profile. And so there's one on the left for therapeutics, one on the right for diagnostics. And I think in both cases, they have the unmet clinical need and/or the therapeutic indication. And as I've been thinking about this, and each time I do this, I think about more. What really should be up here, that it's sort of alluded to in terms of the unmet clinical need and the indication, is what's the clinical decision you're actually addressing. And we'll talk about this in one of the other slides. But I think that's really one of the fundamental things that, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, it's not just about the technology. It's about what problem are you solving that's clinical. And I think if you can actually really think about that, whether it's a new drug, a new class of drug, a new device, a new tool, really thinking about the applications for which this would be the most impactful. And as in terms of that scope of trying to figure out, okay, well, in this broad spectrum of the clinical realm of what you can do, what I drew these up sort of schematically as sort of thought process. So one is you have a technology, and you have a variety of diseases. So you can go into cardiovascular disease or oncology or inflammation. And a lot of the technologies tend to be quite adaptable. So how will you relate your technology to a particular disease? And there's lots of different ways to do that. Another important thing is actually think about the spectrum of disease. Where along from early to late disease is your particular product or technology best potentially applied? And that has a lot to do with, disease severity, clinical presentation, responsiveness to therapies at different times in disease evolution. And then I think C is probably, the thing that I was alluding to in my sort of opening remark is about think about what the decisions are. And obviously this takes a clinical perspective, depending on your background. But one of the biggest issues with clinical practice is deciding, what are the options and how will this new particular product either influence the decision-making process for that particular patient with regard to whatever outcomes metric you're going to do. And so I think that this sort of general idea about defining what your focus is both fun but also quite challenging, because part of it is that at the beginning you have sort of a the breadth luxury of many options, but the challenge is actually how you whittle them down and prioritize. So in terms of the overview, we'll be talking about the next 30 minutes or so is really about where does a TPP fit into a company's workflow or their priorities, and I think it has some different implications from my perspective. And then in terms of the strategy, what are the priorities for how you get this done? How do you align this to sort of corporate goals? Building for need, is my sort of way of summarizing how you actually adapt your technology to a particular use application, as Everett alluded to. And clinical utility as a concept has really sort of risen to the forefront. It's pretty much all over the clinical literature now, and it really means a specific thing, which we'll get to. And then in terms of conceptual stuff for everybody to consider, the general term of intended use, again, has a very specific meaning when applied to biotech product development, which is basically what I've alluded to is a specific clinical condition or disease and state for which you're going to try to modify the decision and or the outcome. The total available market is really sort of a business commercial concept, trying to sort of beginning to objectify downstream sort of clinical, commercial, business, health, economic realm that your product will begin to influence, in particular, capture part of. And the last thing that's also quite important is, part of the general concept of stakeholders. And one of the biggest stakeholders is society practice guidelines, and how you will actually get your product, whether it's a drug or a device or a tool, into guidelines so clinicians will be incentivized and or guided to use them. So, in terms of, key takeaways for the next couple of slides is understanding what the market wants. And market means a very broad thing. It's not just what clinicians want, it's what payers want, it's what regulatory agencies want. And that's actually, depending upon, the scope of your current summer project, that can be challenging to do, but that is probably, where I put it, one of the top things. Understanding sort of, your scope is also going to be influenced by the vision of your executive team, by the board, by your investors, and also how much and what type of resources you have and the time to get it done. What I'm going to talk about after this slide is really about, again, the role of the TPP as both a tool and a goal for a particular company. And then another really key aspect in terms of the project management that Rupal will talk about is the multiple perspectives that go into developing a product. And finally, again, as I alluded to, the financial metrics and practice guidelines. So the point of this slide is really to talk about the target product profile. So it can be represented as a paper document. It is actually an exercise, a key focus document for a project team, where the idea is that you quote, fill in all the boxes. And as part of that exercise, everybody talks about, their priorities and using it as a way to capture, key concepts along the stage of product development. So in of itself, it actually is a both an objective and as a tool for developing a product. And there's many different ways to do this, with the idea of that your final output is a summary document. It has many different names: product requirements document, et cetera, where you basically put in excruciating detail exactly what you're trying to build. So for instance, if you're going to build a new Coke, you would define the size of the can, the thickness of the metal, the color of the packaging, the composition of the soda, the flavor, the sugar content, et cetera. All that potentially goes into a target product profile. And the point of my wheel diagram here with the TPP in the center is that, oftentimes when we've discussed this sort of at this type of meeting, the sort of default is that, well, the scientists and the clinical guys sort of, lead this process and talk about that, which is partly true because many companies are started by, from at a place like UCSF, where that's sort of the nidus of the thought. But really, I think I really try to emphasize this because everybody, both internally and externally, ideally should be part of this process. And although it does add to complexity and very long discussions, what you really want to make sure is that you have everybody's input as early as possible, because if it comes in later in the process, it becomes very difficult to rectify or to change course. And the last bullet point is really important because it's a very dynamic document. It will change over time, as you learn things over the course of a year or two, depending on how long this takes. Typically for a company, that it will be again something that lives and breathes and grows with the company. So let me stop there and take some questions. Nate, if there are questions, if you could mind reading them, so I don't, because I'm not sure about the chat thing.
It doesn't look like there are any questions right now in chat.
Okay, so just let me know if there are questions then. Thanks.
Sounds great.
Okay. So I think so review again. So this is the general idea for this particular session, is really thinking about, as you're developing a profile for your product, what are all the different types of inputs? Again, let me just go to a little more detail. So as we talked about marketing, understanding what the customer wants is very important. Bioinformatics might need a certain number of samples, to achieve a certain algorithmic performance. The manufacturing people might say, well, gee, that sounds great, but we can't get that done. We can't make that particular product. We can't, grow the cells to manufacture the antibodies, et cetera. Or it's a great product, but we'll never get this paid for by CMS or by any private insurance company. Or the FDA, will not approve it because it doesn't meet some sort of need that's currently a standard in the industry. In terms of the,
Bob, before you continue on with the development, we have a couple questions in. Alex asks, where do you keep it? Alex, I'm presuming you're asked where is the TPP kept? All right, so she's asked, is it a fixed, dynamic, a Google Doc, PDF?
Yeah, the great question. So in today's world, whatever your favorite electronic or entity, I've had every people do it in different ways, but ultimately, you could take the old school paper version that I put it into the slide. Usually it will reside with a project team and or a project manager. And so again, where it sits physically or electronically is less issue, but it is generally sort of managed either by a project manager or wherever the team leader is of that particular product.
And great. And we have another question from Anne. I'm going to summarize this, Anne, and if I'm not getting it right, please jump in. So what happens when the very, as you mentioned, excruciating details of the TPP are outlined in that TPP? Does that ever become a constraint later if there's a pivot, if the product changes along a different path?
I'm not sure, and things can be constraints, but I think in general, the idea is to get all these things down. Let's say you start with a blank page and after 3 weeks you have, 47 different items. But by the time the TPP is completed, all 47 items will have been resolved. They'll either been checked off as accepted, or they will have been eliminated through the dynamic discussion process and feasibility analysis. So that there'll be no sort of hanging items by the time the product, but each of those will be a discussion point.
Great, thank you. We're clear to continue on.
Great. So I think in terms of the process priorities, we'll talk about, again, really trying to identify these things early. The resource and timelines things is, again, probably, from a project management perspective that Rupert will talk about, is, again, probably one of the things that's least familiar in an academic setting. But everything, it becomes very, very regimented in terms of, as you're identifying this process to, how much time you have to get it done, and also what the resources are from both a financial and personnel point of view. And scope and feasibility basically talks about, how big of a product, how good of a product, how likely a product are, and that's related to the fourth bullet point about risks. I can't emphasize enough, again, transition from an academic to a biotech perspective. In academia, I think particularly in academic research, you're really pushing the edge on everything. And in product development, it's a little bit different because ideally you have to get this thing done. So one of the key things is not just identifying risks. In other words, will the product work? Can I get this part from this particular place? but it's important to, to identify the ways you can actually lessen or to solve those problems in terms of the risk mitigation. So risk identification, risk mitigation are probably one of the, two key things that are part of this process, not necessarily the goal per se, but definitely an important part of the conversation. And ultimately, I think that, any good project team should be able to present options to the management team. And to the prior question, if there are, constraints or obstacles that need to be resolved, sometimes it does need to go up to a higher level for them to sort of, prioritize or to define how certain corporate objectives can actually, prioritize certain options compared to others. So one of the things that I always like to do, particularly with every new client, is really think about the second bullet point is, what does a company want to do? And that can be quite a broad question. I think for all of you in your groups, you're going to have the same question: is that, is there some burning passion among somebody, whether it's the CEO or the board or somebody on the management team, that you absolutely want to do oncology, or they absolutely want to do some sort of surgical tool? That's a really important thing to consider, because I think that passion accounts for a lot as sort of a resource. And I think in terms of the metrics, whether it's a drug or a device, is think about, how big of a problem are you trying to solve? And, big meaning literally numbers of patients, and big meaning, severity or difficulty of the problem. And as part of that, this whole idea of risk and reward, that's manifested in this really important concept of return on investment, which, basically sounds like it is what it sounds like. It's basically, if you're going to put, a proportion of the company's resources, let's say 30% of the FTEs and the dollar resources, what kind of this product does this need to be for the company to be, successful in the future? Is it a, $5,000 product that yields, $500 million a year? Is it a super expensive product that yields, that will give the value of the company $2 billion? All these things will also be part of the general scope in terms of balancing the priorities. And I think the third bullet point here, in terms of the resource of time, as I've alluded to, particularly in today's world, number one, talent is probably, the always the hardest thing to get across all the different stakeholders that I mentioned in my wheel. And then obviously time and money are implicit in terms of the necessary items to get things done.
Great. And we have a question, if you could elaborate a little bit more on scope and feasibility.
Yeah. So I think scope would be something that's sort of like, sort of in my world in terms of biomarkers. Let's say you had a biomarker for cancer, right? There's many different decisions you could make, that could influence cancers. But so let's say one of the really hot items right now is cancer screening, right? So you're basically trying to develop a test that can look for cancers that you wouldn't otherwise find from standard mammography or some imaging thing, right? And the hot topic right now is multi-cancer screening. So you're going to look across 10, 20, 30 cancers at one time. That's an enormous scope, right? In theory, it'd be great if you could do one blood test and find all these cancers at one time, but also it's a very difficult topic, thing, because the performance metrics you need, how do you get the samples you need? How do you do the clinical studies, right? So in terms of scope, in that example, you could either do dozens of cancers, or you could do one specific cancer as your scope. So you might be more successful doing one cancer, but it might not have the same breadth of clinical impact. And similarly with regard to return on investment, it's, if you take a company like Grail, they raised billions of dollars, but had a great, financial exit. But in terms of the commercial success, that remains to be seen. So, and I think the same thing would apply in drugs. Are you going to do a sort of follow-on drug in a class that already is quite well defined? Or are you going to try to advocate, doing a completely new drug class, which can, treat, both inflammatory and oncologic diseases, right? But then how much money will you need to test that in different diseases? But it could be a big, return on investment, but it also could be quite a large investment too. So you could say, well, gee, instead of doing both, we'll just do oncology, or we'll just do, colon cancer as our first thing. So those are some examples in terms of scope, impact, and how it might affect your ROI.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken.
So in terms of the bill for need thing, I think this is also, part of the aspect of understanding, when I mentioned the term earlier about what the market wants, the market really, again, has many different aspects. So one is the clinical market. So that's the patient, the doc, and the various clinical societies, right? And so even among this group, there are many different subgroups. There's academic physicians, there's primary care doctors, there are surgeons, there's radiologists, there's people who see patients, people more removed, and each of them may have a different perspective on, private practitioners versus academicians versus, large hospitals, small hospitals. All that stuff ideally would be tested out because, again, they may not exactly align. Clinical societies, as you'll see in the last slide, are key because if it's not in the guidelines, it makes it hard to get paid and also to get things adopted. And then, again, each of these is an enormous topic, but the regulatory pathway is different, in terms of therapeutics versus, biomarker diagnostics or tools, and the payers, also have different expectations. I think the crux of this slide is that whatever product you build is going to need to have a lot of data. And the one common currency for all of these stakeholders is data. And you can never have enough data. In general, people don't have enough, particularly when it comes to getting reimbursed and also potentially satisfying clinical guidelines. So I think it's very important to ideally, to get as much input as you can externally as part of your intelligence for moving forward with your TPP and your product development. The issue of clinical utility, again, clinical utility in just the two words have a lot of meaning, but what's particularly evolved in the last decade or so, it's been defined, and particularly in the device and diagnostics world, it has very, very specific meanings. I think drugs are fairly implicit that the impact has to be about, quote, getting rid of the disease, attenuating the disease, and improving both survival, hospitalization, and quality of life. In certain aspects, in particular the two I mentioned, clinical utility has a very, very specific meaning. It means, one, will it make the patient's outcome better? Will they survive? Will they have shorter disease duration? Will it decrease hospitalizations, et cetera, decrease morbidity? And also, will it change the physician's decision? These are specific things that are critical because you have to design your study to answer these questions. And clinical utility studies generally are the latter portion, sort of like the equivalent of a phase 3 trial. But for the device and the biomarker segments, these studies are particularly, obviously, the study designs are more challenging and also more expensive. And part of that clinical utility in terms of being able to improve outcomes or to change vision is that it's got to be different than with the standard of care. New products that are very similar to what's available are generally not going to be that impactful. At the same time, there's also a downside, is that everything has a price, and you can have, for a drug, might have new side effects, even though it's more efficacious. A biomarker might have false positive results. So all these things need to be accounted for, even if you have great clinical utility. And part of the other aspect of a product may work, it may have a lot of clinical benefit, but then does it justify the price? If I said there's a brand new electric car that can go 500 miles, on one battery charge, that's great. Everybody would want it. But what if it costs $200,000, right? Would you pay $200,000 for that car versus a car for $100,000 that can go 300 miles? So these are sort of the things that generally will be talked about as the general, in the general topic of clinical utility.
And is it possible, I guess maybe if we could talk a little bit more about the stakeholder groups and the focus groups. Is it typical for the focus groups with these stakeholders to be held during the development of the TPP? How involved are they?
Yeah, so a focus group is a term that's sort of direct sort of from the marketing field, right? So a focus group is basically generally some sort of selected or identified or invited group of people that you're asking a specific question. And so to broaden the question about, I'll sort of rephrase it as, at what point, should or can, input from any of these groups be obtained? And I would say as much as possible, as soon as possible, and all along through the process. So for instance, obviously a place like UC, there's no dearth of academic input, but sometimes academic input is biased because of the excellence, biased because the people are less familiar with the actual standard of care that's outside of an academic center. So for instance, right now, there's a huge prioritization of what's called real world experience, largely because many, great, trials that are published in the New England Journal that are done in academic networks, they can't be replicated outside of that because you don't have the quality of the clinicians or the surgeons or the radiologists or even the nursing care. Those cannot be replicated outside of academic centers, and so the translatability of the data, the efficacy data, may not be possible. So I think that understanding, again, all of these different stakeholders is important. In terms of payers, you can definitely convene, chief medical officers of private insurance companies and also CMS, get their input early, talk to them about your study design concepts before you do them. Absolutely is a possibility, and there's processes for that. And same thing for regulatory agencies. So the one thing that people you cannot engage with are clinical societies per se. In other words, they're largely data, published literature driven. However, there are many, docs, both academic and non-academic, who sit on these societies, and having them, either a single interview or be part of your advisory board are also ways to get this input during the process.
Great, very keen insights. Thanks, Ken.
Okay. So sort of moving towards finishing off. So I think that I want to talk about intended use. So again, intended use really applies to a specific thing. So what I just had it here again is sort of from a biomarker sort of things that I've done is, how you define intended use is an important part of the product development. So I give two examples here. So the first is general, and the second is more specific. And so this pertains to lung cancer screening. So I just write, the intended use of the test is to provide clinicians with a tool to screen for lung cancer, as opposed to the second one, which says the objective of the test is to help clinicians assess and identify somebody who has a lung nodule on a chest CT scan, and the patient is also asymptomatic. So there are two aspects of lung cancer, but the second is a very, very specific thing. So if you go to a regulatory agency or to a payer or to a society, they will expect you to be able to articulate, again, as I alluded to earlier, what is the specific question that you're addressing with your drug or tool or device or biomarker test. And this will, again, be an essential part of the product development process. So in closing, the other thing I talked about was total available market. So, or it's also a total addressable market for the A. But what you're basically trying to do is, at a very, very macroscopic scale, is trying to figure out at a certain price point for your product, right? How many patients might benefit from it? What is the price of the product, and how many times would they use it in a particular year or whatever time frame you're talking about, right? So it's a pretty straightforward equation, and I've simplified it here into the parameters I mentioned, right? And so in this particular case, if you had something that costs $1,000 and use it twice a year, for instance, and you had 100,000 patients, your TAM would be about $200 million, right? And so this is an important thing, because as part of the ROI, you want to think, okay, well, if my total available market is $200 million, and I can capture 20% of that, that's a pretty good, initial, TAM, $40 million, right? And so the bottom graph is really just talking about conceptually is that, if you have really good high clinical utility, you're going to be able to charge a lot more money for your product. For instance, like an orphan drug can command, hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars for stem cell therapies, right? The more options there are, the less likely you're going to be able to command a higher price. And so there's going to be a trade-off in terms of the quality of your product, in terms of clear utility, and essentially the x-axis is another way of talking about competitive landscape. So the more competitive your space is, that's also going to impact your particular price point. but it could be offset by, again, how large your population that could benefit from your product. So these are, again, 3 general variables. So you could have a less expensive product that you use 4 times a year, every 3 months. So that all these things can offset. So depending upon, whether it's a drug or a test or a device, how often you use it is also very important. What commercial people like to call repeat testing or repeat use is really a key driver of commercial success.
All right, we have a quick question from Ofer. Ofer, would you like to ask Ken this question? What Ofer is saying is, would LTV to CAC be better for screening, for example?
LT, could you, I'm not sure what the acronym stand
Yeah,
for.
I can iterate it. So with lifetime value, if you're going for a screening test, for example, lifetime value for against customer acquisition cost, which is used generally in tech bio, that's in bio, would it be better for like a screening than better measurement than TAM or SAM?
Yeah, well, also because, screening is a very complicated topic, and maybe not the best example. I understand your question, but basically in terms of the right. So in terms of what you're talking about customer acquisition, yeah. So the price point, like for instance, like in this specific example, screening, typically the price point is going to be lower, mainly because in this particular case, your comparators are things like, a CT scan or a mammogram, which are in the multi-$100 range, right? And so, however, the value can be substantial, right? So in terms of the calculus, it's actually pretty complicated. Again, it will be very specific as to what the clinical question you're talking about. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that the cost of a product and also the health economic benefit or impact are going to be heavily dependent upon the particular clinical scenario.
And in terms of frequency of use, in your estimation, are we making the assumption that the same product cannot be used more than once?
No, I don't think so. For instance, like a drug, is often given in cycle, like for oncology drug, it's given, in cycles. Medications can be given periodically for exacerbations. Let's say, once or twice a year. Tests can be often used multiple times per year for repeat testing, and the clinical medicine is based on repeated things. So imaging studies are done quite often. So frequency of use really, again, will depend upon the problem, but again, it's an integral part of what your product does, and again, what the disease is that will determine the frequency of use.
Yeah, I was just asking, like, in terms of the total available market. So then you multiply your frequency of use by the number of candidates and the price. But if you're only purchasing it once and you can use it multiple times, then why should the number of frequency of use it go into that equation?
Okay, yeah, I understand. Okay, so let's say you bought a home monitor for something, right? You're right. So if you only buy it once, right? If the number of times you use it doesn't matter. But in terms of what I'm talking about is that each use of a product is an independent event, so that the use is, again, like a something that you have to write a separate prescription for, or if you're ordering a particular test, like an MRI scan, each one of those will be an independent event. But you're right, for something that is a device that you can use over and over again, you're right, that only counts as one time.
Got it. Thank you.
Great, and we're getting a lot of different questions about market size. One question is, and you may have to wear a venture capital hat for this one, is how optimistic should one be when they consider the size of the market, the global, the national, the local? We get this question all the time, and when Jenny and I do pitch deck coaching, it's kind of tricky because you don't want to oversell, but you also don't want to undersell the size of the market.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. It's funny, I just had this discussion last week too, right? Which is that, I can tell you, having pitched to many VCs, right? Most VCs will automatically discount whatever you tell them by, they'll divide it by 2, right? Just because they know that they're always going to be optimistic. But I think that for instance, so it's a great question because it is part of the TPP. So let's say you say, okay, the worldwide TAM that we estimate for this is $5 billion. Okay, great. If you say that, your pitch deck has to include how you're going to address the ex-USA market and all those other risks, right? So I think that you have to decide on, are you willing to defend your rationale for calculating a worldwide TAM versus a US TAM or a adult population greater than 50 TAM, right? So whatever it is, however you are going to pitch your TAM, you should be able to defend it along with the risks and benefits of actually having that broader, narrow TAM. So it's not the fact that what's the largest TAM you can think of. It's about can you defend that TAM within the context of your product development effort and also what your company's risk tolerance is.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, was there a follow-up question on that?
I wasn't sure if someone was jumping in just then to ask out loud. Another different question is if you have any insights on the ethics and affordability to individuals in a lower socioeconomic group. Is this all up to the individual company, or are there any kind of standards that you're aware of out there for, I guess, affordability for the different price points and different socioeconomic groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, one extreme example would be sort of drug pricing, right? So clearly that is basically what the market will tolerate here in the United States, right? So basically it's the highest price for an efficacious product that satisfies, again, these conditions where you have a novel product that does something that other drugs can't do. Companies will charge the absolute highest price and they'll push the limit knowing that it will be discounted and pushed back from payers and various societies. In terms of a more sort of, socially conscious, question, the way it was asked in terms of addressing sort of socioeconomic stratification of a product development, pricing is a business thing, right? And so it ultimately will be determined by the corporate governance, by the executive team and the board. But again, because you're in a business, right? The objective of the business is to make money, and that's actually, not the primary concept, particularly in academic center like UCSF. But if you think about the resources and the time and the risk that goes into product development, companies are obligatorily, they have to be profitable unless they're a nonprofit. I don't think that's what we're talking about today. But if that is the question, for a nonprofit to price, that's a whole different thing, because then it just comes down to, whatever your, if quote, break-even strategy is. But typically, pricing is a very complex topic in itself, mainly because there's things like list price, which is what your public price is, but everybody knows things like drugs and tests and devices all get discounted. There's different prices for payers, and different payers pay different prices for things. So I think that, hopefully it was feisty that the pricing really is a complex thing, but typically the best way to sort of narrow that initially would be to focus on list price and thinking about sort of discounting for other reasons, including a socioeconomic thing later on.
Yeah, good points. I'm sure pricing could be a whole workshop all in and of itself. So in the interest of time, we'll continue on. Thank you, Ken.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's not a workshop. It's like what people spend like months and years talking about.
There you go.
The last thing I want to talk about, again, that I can't emphasize enough of is that is our guidelines, is looking at, all societies publish guidelines on pretty much everything, taking drugs as an example, or even, biomarker tests or imaging, right? They will basically issue these things periodically, every couple of years or so, and they will make either recommendations or, pseudo requirements for standard of care. And these are important because they have a quasi-legal ramifications too. If you don't follow guidelines and there's bad outcomes, people can say, well, this is what the guidelines says you should, why didn't you do that, doctor, right? But however, recognizing that the guidelines themselves they're not necessarily concrete, they're based on what's called levels of evidence. And the levels of evidence really are based on public literature and also what's called, expert opinion or key opinion leader opinion. And so there, in areas where there is a lack of data, things might actually make it into the guidelines based on, expert opinion, even though there's not great data to support it, or there may be, controversy when there's some literature but not enough. But I think, having said that, the guidelines are really important things to have, because insurance companies will actually refer to them and generally use them as a reason to not pay for something. It's very easy for them to say, it's not in the guidelines, we're not paying for it. Right. And so for drugs, it's different, because generally, if you satisfy the registry trials of phase 3, you will actually get paid. But for other things, for devices, it's not as clear cut. But nevertheless, the goal of every product is eventually to ideally make it into the guidelines, because it just makes it that much easier for clinicians to adopt them, or at least have a reason to adopt them. So it's good to sort of, and this is also the competitive landscape approach, is to look at what the current standard of care is and understanding, because everybody will look to this as sort of the bar quote to be used clinically. So I think that's sort of the key topics for this particular discussion. So in summary, what I really tried to emphasize is understanding what the market wants, meaning clinicians, payers, all the various stakeholders, thinking about the scope for your product, but taking into account of what the senior team thinks about vision, and also your particular resources. And again, thinking about that this process of a TPP is really both an objective in of itself, and also something that's going to help you coordinate the team activities along this the life of the company, and getting all these different perspectives early, not just clinical, not just scientific, is very important. And then, obviously, if you can, thinking about the financial economic aspects are going to be important, as well as trying to meet the standards that are set by external groups like clinical societies. So thank you all for your time and your questions, and I'd be happy to take a couple more questions if there's time.
Hey, Ken, hey, you know what? That was really great. I really liked the way you emphasized what was important from your perspective as a clinician and a company executive. So, Nate, I'm assuming there's no, and and thanks for all those great questions too. It's great.
Yeah, great questions.
So, we're going to move on to the next presentation. This is going to be by Rupa Ramamurthy. Rupa is the Senior Associate Director of the Catalyst Program at UCSF, and also for the Invent Fund, the Innovation Ventures Philanthropy Fund that she might mention. It's similar to Catalyst, but it supports projects with promise with much higher levels of funding. It can go, up to like $1 million or even $2 million possibly. And so Rupa went to the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay in bioengineering, and then came to the United States and got a PhD from Caltech, and then did a postdoc at MIT and took a job at Bayer Corporation, and then spent many years at the WIPO Research, the BioVentures for Global Health, until she moved to UCSF almost 6 years ago exactly. And so we're lucky to have Rupa present today. Actually, Rupa has both a certificate in project management and as well as a certificated project management professional. So she's really an expert in, capital P, capital M project management. And so she's going to talk today about some of the tools of project management that actually could have some utility for the TPP. So Rupa, take it away.
Thank you, Charles. And let me just get the presentation. Can you all see it? I'll move it in presentation mode. Okay, so today I will cover project management and a little bit on how the target product profile can be used as a tool in project management. So of course, we all know that the Warriors won, but before they won, they also were building their stadium, and we actually saw it at UCSF come up. And a project, it's like the building of the Warrior Stadium. It has a definite beginning and a definite end. And like for the building of the stadium, they'd first have to lay the foundation, then build it. At some point, put the electrical wiring, etc. So this is the Gantt chart below is an example of a project where you have all the tasks on the left side. Then you have the start date, end date, and dependencies. Like, for example, one task has to be done before the other. You cannot build the building before the foundation is laid. So this is just an example of one of those Gantt charts. And in the project, there are 5 process groups. The first is the initiation of the conception and initiation of the project, where you have the project charter, the project is approved by the sponsors, and then there is the planning. And every project needs a good plan. And in the plan, you define what is the scope, what will be accomplished, what is the budget, which will again depend on the scope. And then you develop a detailed work breakdown schedule. And you develop the Gantt, put together the Gantt chart, similar to what I'd shown in the last slide. And then you need a communication plan. What is communicated to whom and when? For example, to the management team, you may just give a very easy to visualize dashboard with what green, yellow, and red in terms of what's on track, what's needing alert, and what's not on track. And then a risk management plan, which I will discuss later. Then you also have then after that, you launch the project. And once the project, as the project is being executed, there is monitoring and control. So how is the project doing with respect to schedule, cost, as well as scope compared to what was planned? And if necessary, you're monitoring this, you're tracking it, and you may have to adjust to control it, to bring it again back. And then finally, there's the closeout of the project, where you do a post-mortem, lessons learned, and also create any reports that need to be created. So in project for risk management, in risk management planning, you identify what are all the risks. And the risk could be technical risks, it could be business risks, it could be personnel risks, regulatory risks, clinical risks, whatever risks are there. Then you assign, then you analyze. So is the probability of the risk occurring high, medium, or low? And then if the risk does happen, what is the impact? Is it high, medium, or low? And how do you avert the risk, or the risk response planning? For example, say you have a sole supplier for a medical device part. Now, there could be some problem with the supplier. Let's say the risk is medium. Now, if that happens, of course, your project will be held back. There'll be all kinds of bottlenecks. So the impact felt would be high. So one way to mitigate that is to identify and qualify an alternate supplier, so that if one supplier fails, you could use an alternate supplier. A simple way we do risk mitigation, we all get health insurance, right? So that if something happens, we mitigate the risk. Then in the risk, when the project is being executed, there is monitoring the risk. So you have the risk register of all the risks. You're monitoring if any of them is likely to happen. If it happens, how are you going to avoid it? Or, I mean, how are you going to mitigate it? Or how are you going to avoid or work around the risks? So now what I'll be talking about is project management for Catalyst awardee projects. So I'll introduce project management, advantages of project management, talk about project goals and aims associated. Now these goals and aims are associated with a budget, a schedule, and certain milestones, and tracking of the project progress against aims and associated milestones. Now, these are the pipelines for the therapeutics, diagnostic, medical device, digital health tracks. And what is here is this represents some of the activities that a Catalyst project may have, like as part of the scope of the projects. And in the projects, there is the triangle, the 3 edges of the triangle, the cost, the scope, and schedule. Now, if the scope of the project is increased, or you need to do more, it may increase the cost, it may increase the schedule. Or supposing someone says, okay, you have to get this done within the next 3 months. You might have to reduce the scope of the project. to deliver something within 3 months. And why do you need to do project management? It helps to keep focused on the project goals and aims. By developing a project plan, you really think about the project, what are all the issues? And then once you have a plan, as the project is executed, you can track the progress against the plan, and you have much better chances by actively managing a project to achieve the goals. And yes, sometimes projects may need to pivot and change, but at least you have a defined process and justification for pivoting the project when needed. It's like, I think someone said, like when you don't have a goal, you can get anywhere, right? And let's take an example, okay? Climbing Mount Everest. Now say climbing Mount Everest is the goal, but you need to have aims along the way, right? Reaching base camp, reaching camp 2, camp 3, and then you'd have the logistics, right? Like what is the time? You have to reach a certain camp at a certain time when there is daylight, sunlight. What is the schedule? What would be the cost to have the Sherpas, have all the equipment carried to that point, right? So similarly in the Catalyst project, you have goals based on what is supported by the Catalyst Award, and you have clear milestones to be accomplished with certain aims. So each aim is associated with a given schedule and budget. For example, one of the aims could be to identify inhibitors for the target kinase. And the milestone would be, say, identifying inhibitors in the low micromolar range with desired selectivity against other kinase targets. I'm just giving a makeup example here. Now, this is examples like, say, for therapeutic projects. Say, you could have certain, like doing the MedChem and SAR, and it's associated with a certain timeline, a certain budget. And then the milestone would be identifying the hit. Similarly, say in medical device, you could be prototyping and bench testing, and then in a certain time under certain budget and develop the first version of the prototype. I'd covered this before, but I'd go through it again. So you originally have the project plan, right? Where you have the scope of the project, the cost, and the schedule. Then as the project is executed, you monitor the project, compare it to the plan. What is the actual schedule, actual cost, and actual scope that has been completed versus the plan? At every intermediate step, you can monitor as you go along. And then you may take actions to correct. For example, if there are deviations from the plan, you may correct. For example, say a project is growing slower. Now, is your schedule more important or is your cost? If you're getting to the right schedule, getting it back on schedule is more important, and it is possible to add more personnel to get it back on track, you may do that. Or you may outsource to a CRO if needed. There are different ways to get a project. For example, say when COVID was there, right? UCSF labs were shut down. So you may say, okay, how do we get this project still moving? Maybe we can move some of the activities to a CRO in another country. Then the actual project progress versus the project plan. So again, this is tracking the project, like the aims that versus what has been achieved in a given time, and the milestones to be reached with given aims, have those been reached? And plan budget to reach the milestones versus actual budget spent. And we look at 2 examples. Now say this is the proposed plan, and this is what is actually happening. So what is actually happening is the timeline has been pushed. So getting your lead ID would come later. And this was, for example, say because of COVID, you had restrictions and limited lab capacity. And so the timeline was pushed. In another example, supposing this is proposed for a medical device, okay, prototyping and bench testing, and say it was at a CRO and they were actually able to do it much quicker, then you're getting to your design freeze earlier. And this is like different ways to put together project plans, like you can do it on MS Project or Smartsheet, for which UCSF has a license. And this is just, I removed many details, but this is just an example of a project plan I put together where you have the tasks on the left side, the start, end dates, person complete, and also what task depends on what. So you have the arrows which show dependencies. You can't do something before you do the other. For example, before you produce a protein, you cannot crystallize the protein. Or so some activities depend on other activities. And here some of the tasks were being conducted at UCSF and some of them were being conducted at another organization. And the tracking shows which tasks are complete and what percent complete. And now, like with target product profiles, as you're all going to be putting together target product profiles, and how do target product profiles help in project management? For example, you've defined how good a small molecule inhibitor for NASH needs to be in preclinical animal models to move forward. And this may be based on previous studies of molecules that move from preclinical to clinical and how well did they do in particular animal models. And you have to do at least as well or better. Then in managing the project, we'll see, like, are your small molecule inhibitors performing equally well in those animal models, what you're defined in the TPP as minimal required. And based on that, you could make a go, no-go decision. If the endpoint is not met, you may say, okay, we really cannot move this project forward. And similarly, like in clinical trials, you have inclusion, exclusion criteria, who can be enrolled in a clinical trial, who cannot be enrolled. And one of the important things in project management and clinical trials is to get patients enrolled in sufficient numbers and achieved in a timely manner. And you may have different sites and you're actively monitoring how the patient enrollment is going, if you need to bring in new sites or you get sufficient enrollment and you don't need to bring in new sites. And then, for example, in a medical device, okay, then you have performance requirements defined for a medical device. And again, we'll be project managing and making no-go decisions based on whether the minimal or optimal performance requirements are met. And again, you have key design challenges. And these are part of the target product profile for a medical device. And here, you will have, you'll develop a risk management plan like the one I discussed earlier to address the key design challenges. What are they? How are you going to manage them? How are you going to mitigate them? And just as a recap, the three three sides are the cost, the scope, and the schedule. And what I didn't mention, what would be inside, is also quality, because you cannot compromise the quality of a product. And then there are the goals, and then monitoring and tracking the project. And I will leave you with a cartoon. And any questions?
No questions so far in chat. If anyone has one, feel free to ask it in chat or unmute yourself to ask Rupa directly.
Hey, Rupa, thank you very, very much. That was a great summary about project management in general, and then the specific sort of tools, well, the specific way that a target product profile fits in to Catalyst, to academic healthcare projects, whether it's drug discovery or diagnostics discovery or medical device or digital health. So thanks a lot. Rupa, can you just describe a little bit about like a lot, the thing is that project management is a great career for people that are interested in both the science and the business aspects of, let's say, medicine. So can you just summarize really quick how project managers sort of spend their day and interact with other team members?
Yeah, and what helps, like in a career, like at least like I've seen, like when I was at Bayer and stuff, people typically start out at the bench. They may work as a scientist or a research associate. And so you are part of the project teams. And then you develop in a project management, you could take classes, you could take courses, get into project management. And what a project manager would do typically is work with the project team, get the project planned, right? And you really have to listen to the team because it is bottom up. When the people who are actually working on the bench, they know how long something will take. What is the work package? So you cannot impose it from top. You have to have a dialogue with them. So you have to develop the plan in conjunction with them. Work with the team when you develop the risk management plan, right? So that you get the team engaged. A large part of it will be putting the Gantt chart, monitoring the project, developing the communication, whether it's communications with the team, the meeting minutes, the agreements, what is agreed on, what are the action items for the next time, but also communicating summaries to management, to the other stakeholders. And as Ken had mentioned earlier, for putting together the target product profile, you need different people on the team. And similarly, a project management for an early stage, say, therapeutic project, you'll have people from preclinical, toxicology, discovery, CMC. As you go later, if you're going into clinical or a later project management, you may need people on the team who are from marketing, who are from, of course, clinical, regulatory, because as you move into the market, their inputs are needed also, right? Means their inputs are in the target product profile, but also they may have a vision like, okay, if this clinical trial is going this way, then how do they market it? So they are also involved to think about it. So it is a lot of what a project manager also does is communication, communicating with team members, communicating with stakeholders, communicating with the sponsors. And when communication doesn't mean just saying things, it also means listening, understanding what people are saying. And understanding how people want to be communicated with.
Yeah, go ahead, Ken, please chime in.
Yeah, Rupa, I just want to say, just as a sort of a supporting your comment, I can't agree more with what you just said. I think the word engagement and communication, I think particularly for people in academics like UCSF where such roles generally do not exist. I mean, I had no idea what project management was when I left UCSF, and it was, frankly, a sort of a big surprise and a shock to me. But I think that people need to understand that the project manager role is actually a critical function in a company. It's probably the third thing that I mentioned on a consulting thing, that the project manager is such a central figure in a company, not just specific to a particular project. I've seen project managers have, frankly, dominant, if not critical roles in particularly in the early stage companies, because they pretty much are involved in everything. It's not just about managing this or managing that. They are, as Rupa said, they're actually one of the key communicators to the management teams because they have objectivity. And I think particularly for people who have PhD backgrounds in science, I think that, whether it's therapeutics or device or biomarkers, my first company I worked with probably 3 or 4 project managers in the first year and a half. And ultimately, it was a guy with a PhD in whatever biology that he had, who was the best because he intrinsically understood the issues with science, laboratory issues, things that people who don't have a scientific background can't really understand. So I think there's many different types of project managers, but I would definitely offer it up as a critical role. And I think personality makes a big difference as well. So if people are thinking about, ways to enter biotech, I think for the right personality type, it's great.
Great. We have a couple questions in chat, and then we'll get to Riley's presentation. Rupa, how does one calculate the cost of crashing a week when you're behind schedule? Is it usually as simple as just adding up the salaries of the extra personnel?
See, it is a complicated thing because sometimes you can bring in more personnel. Sometimes you can't. If someone is very specialized in something and you can't just throw in more people. So it'll have to depend on what the task is, whether you can crash it with more people. And again, it depends. Is budget or cost your most important issue, or is time your most important issue? If it is like, oh, we just cannot exceed the cost, okay, take more time. Or it is, we don't care about the cost, we need to get this done soon. So there are all kinds of things, considerations that will have to come in. at that point.
Oh, great. And both Rupa and kind of Ken mentioned of that personality type of a good project manager. Rupa talked a lot about the communication, not just communicating, but also listening. How would you guys describe the personality type that thrives in a project management role?
Well, I think there's definitely different personality types, and because I think there's different project managers. But I think one key thing is somebody who's a leader, because I think that you actually have to help. So typically most teams will have a project manager and a team leader. So a team leader is often somebody who's the domain expert, like a clinical person, right, or a scientific person or a technical person. And the project manager, they generally will together sort of quote manage the entire group. So I think leadership skill is very important, because sometimes you have to make tough decisions, and there's a lot of problems, a lot of critical things that come up. I think another aspect of personality would be diplomacy. Somebody who really understands, like Rupa again emphasized, listening and communication. Those are features, but ultimately how you translate what you've heard into how you speak to somebody. For instance, like how do you resolve a 50-50 split conflict, right? One side is not going to have their way. So all these things are very important. So I would say those are the two features, qualities that come to mind in terms of being a good and or effective project manager, is leadership and diplomacy.
And to Ken's point, to add to that, again, you didn't, just like you need different CEOs, different management at different stages of the company, like a project manager for early means like up to preclinical. It would be helpful if a person has a research background, a background in process development, a scientific. Now, when you're going into clinical trials, you need really a more experienced person, not on the science side, because it's just like how many patients can you enroll and stuff, but a person who's very good at interacting with diverse groups like clinical, regulatory, marketing, senior leadership, because right now the pressure is get it to the market as soon as possible and quickly. So you need different types of project managers also at different stages.
Great answers. And one last quick question, and then we'll get to Riley and global data. Rupa, are there equivalents to agile or waterfall strategies specifically in biotech?
See, I personally just did the PMP, the traditional project management. So I don't really know agile and waterfall, and I'm not up to speed on those. So I don't know how they are applied exactly in. So I will pass on that for now.
It was a great question, though. So Rupa, thanks so much. And then Ken, thanks for chiming in. The one thing I decided I'm going to add one thing about the role of the project manager is that, and this actually fits with what Ken and Rupa were saying. I just have to figure out how to word this. The expression, good cop, bad cop. Project managers are usually at the front of adherence to milestones and tasks. They can really be the ones that are the task masters and keep everybody going. Because remember, when Rupa talked about those contingent situations, that an early thing that's important, in her case, the foundation of the Chase Center, if that foundation is late, then everything's late. And so the project managers realize that any sort of, let's say, glitches or holdups early in a process can get translated to all the way through the process. And that's one of the reasons that the risk management plan or the risk register is so important. But in my experience, project management, and Ken said this with the word diplomacy, if they're the ones that are really the person that'll come up and say, you're 2 weeks behind, how can I help you? Or what do you think? They really have to be diplomatic in sharing that, in sharing the news that a certain person is behind where they should be, and really have to pick their game up. But anyway, it is, for people that are interested, it's a great, it's a great role. It's a great role, and they're in high demand, and you can live anywhere and make a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. So
Okay.
without,
Extremely
go
high
ahead,
demand.
Ken, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's an extremely high demand role, and finding a good project manager, partly because, again, think of it this way, they're essentially the quarterback of that team. And I've seen many companies, in the Series A early start thing, where they are really one of the key personalities of that company.
Yeah, they're both the quarterback, Ken, as well as the referee, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. I like that.
Okay, so thanks, Rupa. Thanks, Ken. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our last presentation. It's by Riley Gardner. Riley is an account executive at Global Data, which is a business intelligence database that, and Global Data is one of the leading sort of business intelligence firms in the world. They're headquartered in the UK, and they really cover most, if not all, the industries. But of course, we're in the Catalyst program focused on their medical device and their therapeutics programs. Riley is a recent graduate of the Bucknell University, and he's talking to us from Manhattan in New York City. And so we're glad that Riley took time out of his late, well, not that late, but middle of the evening to talk to us. So take it away, Riley.
Yeah, thanks, Charles, and hi, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you on the other side of the country. And like Charles said, I'm over in Manhattan, so you guys are almost about to witness golden hour behind me. So it's a good timing. But quickly, I'll go over what global data is and what you guys have access to in the market intelligence.
Sorry, Riley. Sorry,
Yes.
excuse me for a second. I'm not sure the people on the call know what golden hour is, but I happen to.
Oh, okay.
Well, why don't you describe it? Because I know what it is.
Well, I mean, for Manhattan, the sun sets right behind me, so the whole city glows up for around probably like 15 or so minutes, and that's why it's all golden. That's why it's called
Right,
golden hour.
because like for 3 days of the year, the sun sets directly down the avenues, right?
That was yesterday, exactly.
Oh,
right
yesterday,
down,
sorry.
right
Maybe
down one of the streets. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, take it away, Riley. Thanks.
All right, but yeah, as Charles said, I work within the customer success division here at Global Data, and essentially what I do is I work with technology transfer offices and consultancies, and just help them leverage our data to the best way possible, so they're getting the most use out of their money and time when they use Global Data. And today, basically, briefly, just an introduction into Global Data, what you can utilize in the Catalyst program, our data, and how most of the people that I work with in consultancies and technology transfer offices, how they utilize our market research and analysis here. And then if we have time, I know it was a stop at 8:30. If we have time, a brief demo of what you can access in the pharmaceutical platform. So just a brief introduction into Global Data. We are, as Charles said, a market intelligence firm. We work with around 4,000 clients globally. So 4,000 clients trust our data, around 22 different industries, but what you guys have access to at the program is the medical device center as well as the pharmaceutical side. And what I'm showing here is within the pharmaceutical database, the databases that you guys have access to and what you'll be utilizing most. So just to bring it around the circle, just very quickly, you have access to all pipeline and marketed drugs out there for all indications. And we also have rare diseases as well. And we're slowly building our rare disease coverage day by day. And then within those drugs in the pipeline, we do have trials intelligence. So you can track what's going on within those clinical trials and details surrounding those, as well as you can look back on past clinical trials for those drugs that are on the market. Next, on the bottom right-hand side, we have the analysis and epidemiology section. So for our analysis, our in-house analysts, we have around 200 of them, all with a master's/PhD or master's and above, I should say. And they're going out doing their own primary research and talking to key opinion leaders to create these in-depth industry reports that not only are assessing the market as it is today on an indication level, but also forecasting forward what they think will be most prominent moving forward within that indication space. And along with that, you also have access to our epidemiology data. So we have raw epi data that is used to calculate our patient-based forecasting for indications, or you can see our sales data based off of that epi data, and it's really good for also market sizing as well. And then lastly, what's new to global data is our investigative journalists who are tracking news, recent events, and just key market events going on within the pharmaceutical space. And then lastly, to bring it around full circle, our methodology and frameworks are always included, so we're most comfortable with our data. Moving on to conducting market research with global data. The first thing I wanted to talk about is just viewing key indications in a competitive landscape. The first thing I'm going to bring you to is within our drugs database, everything you can refine by. So the most common ones I would say is you can get a complete view within any indication. Right now listed are our therapy areas and rare diseases you can also get and dive deeper into, as well as development stages within those, molecule type, route of administration, MOA, target, drug descriptor, you name it. So you can mix and match all of these different refinements to kind of get your sweet spot of what you're looking for. And that way you can get a complete view of what's going on within the space for a drug. And when we hit, when I hit search, if I have time at the end, this is what I'll bring you to. But when we hit search, you can see all of the drugs within a space that you're searching along with the companies that are with those drugs. And next, so you have the complete view of the landscape of what's going on within that indication or whatever you search. But now also within our analyst reports, you can also view the unmet needs and opportunity assessment within those indications. So in this case, I pulled a figure from our multiple sclerosis report, and you can just see what our analysts believe are the unmet needs and opportunity assessments. So you kind of get two sides of an indication here, so you can see what's going on in current day and in our present data, and then also what our analysts believe will be important moving forward. Next, we also include general product information for all of the drugs, both marketed and pipeline. In this case, I included two things of safety and efficacy details for a marketed drug. And basically for any marketed drug or pipeline drug, it just depends on the differences, but we have sales and forecast data, marketed data, pipeline data, regulatory information, as well as any history of changes. So you can get a complete view of an asset, whether it be in the pipeline or to market. And you can also see what indications that drug has been used for. So all the indications are listed as well. Lastly, and probably what I work mostly within consultancies is finding the potential economic value of specific indications. And just to take you around these 4 slides. Firstly, just understanding what's in the pipeline in a specific area or specific indication. So you could see the different product profiles listed as on the left, which is this was taken from an MS report. So you have a competitive assessment on the product profiles within this space, and then also what's in the development of the pipeline within MS. And you can see all of the products within there. Next, take it from the same report. So you have what's happening again at the time, but also a market outlook. And all of our market outlooks / our reports are covering the US, Japan, and then the 5 major European countries. So you could see our forecast of what our analysts believe will happen in the future, the key events that are affecting that forecast, and then also some drivers and barriers that will happen within that time period. Moving on, like I said in the beginning, we do have a market sizing and epidemiology data. So this is for, I believe this is taken off an Excel report for, again, MS. In this case, we're looking at the United States epi data. So you could see total population with MS, and it's broken down into different segments. And then you could see on the top all those different bubbles. So you have epi, patient share, days of therapy, and then at the bottom, total sales. So all that's included within these Excel. So it's really great for market sizing and seeing the potential of a specific indication. And then all of this is forecasted into 2030. And it's also worth noting that all of these cells are unlocked. So if you wanted to take the data and run off somewhere with it and do your own calculations with it, or just change it within this Excel doc, you can do that as well. And then last but not least, competitor sales data. So you can pick and choose different products. And again, you could choose marketed or pipeline products. Our analysts do forecast pipeline products given once they hit a certain development stage, I think so. But you could see side by side what their past sales were, and then also what we're forecasting based off analyst consensus. So again, you have a complete 360-degree view of what's happening within certain areas. You can get into the nitty-gritty and go into specific sales data, or you can get a general idea of what's happening within this certain indication based off the epi data and also our forecasts moving forward. And I believe I've 3 quick minutes, so let me share a different screen and just quickly, won't take that long. Where is my Chrome? Just Charles, 'cause I can see your face. Can you see that? Can you see that I should be on the drugs database?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So basically, I showed you one of the screenshots earlier of the drugs database and all of the different refinements that we can refine by. And what I added here, just to stick to the theme of MS, I added that indication, and then we want to look at the drugs within in phase 0 and phase 1. And again, you can add any other refinements on the left-hand side, but for this case, just to keep it short and sweet. And then when we hit search, it's going to give us a list of, so in this case, we have 57 drugs that meet our criteria. We have the drug name, generic name, what company it's associated with, and then also on the right-hand side, what phase it's in, where it's located geographically, and then also if there's any other indications this drug may be in clinical trials for. And again, there's other tools to play with on global data. Again, this is a very short introduction. I mean, usually when I take people through it, it takes 45 minutes to an hour, but just as a very general introduction, that's what you guys will have access to eventually. And I believe Charles, or maybe we have to set that up or set up another training session, but in what was that, 10 short minutes, that's what global data is, and the research and the market data that you guys have available to you.
Hey, Riley, thanks so much. That was really interesting. And I can attest from using this for the last couple summers that it's, at first it looks a little, well, for me, it was a little intimidating with all, you just look at the screen, all the buttons and pull down this and tap that. But once you try it a couple times, it's pretty intuitive. And like Riley just said, we're going to have a training session. And like he said, it'll be 45 minutes to an hour to teach the folks that are the people that are interested in learning how to use it, specifically how to use it. And like I just like I just typed in my reply to Melanie, for all of you that have a ucsf.edu email address, it's pretty straightforward. There's no real issues. For those of you that don't, and Riley knows that we have some students, we have some people from different institutions, it's just a little trickier, but we have something that's worked in the past where, Nate or Rupa or Jenny or I will do it with you, right? So, but we haven't scheduled the training, and I think it's smart if we schedule that as quickly as possible. So I'll get back together with Nate and Rupa and Jenny and Riley and his colleagues at Global Data and find out the best possible time for training. And hopefully Riley will have more than one, because you know how it is with scheduling in the context of Zoom, that
of course, yeah,
we want to do something. So hopefully there'll be, 2 training sessions that people can choose from. But again, Riley, thanks so much for doing that. And hopefully you'll be able to get outside and see the sun setting right down.
I believe it just set, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you
Cool.
though. And
Okay,
yeah.
so we're right at 5:30, which is great. But if there's any last questions, and Nate, I don't know if there's any in the, I guess I can see the chat. I don't see the little red ball. So I just want to thank everyone for joining tonight, both the interns and the PIs and the Innovation Ventures staffers. And I thought it was really good. I got a lot of, I learned quite a bit from all 4 of the sessions, including Jenny's and Stephanie's. So thank you all very much. And we'll see you. Well, some of you I'll see you tomorrow, but the rest of you, we have a 3rd workshop in mid-October. Excuse me, God bless it, in mid-August. So I'll see the rest of you in mid-August of the next workshop. So thank you very much.